video games, a means that was once simply used to entertain children, or perhaps pass the time on a rainy day, has since transformed into the foundation of countless childhoods and has become an important part in both tech and human history. Welcome to a moment in gaming history.
Alright, let's take you all back in time to the year of our Lord, 1998. Pokemon Red and Blue, and in Japan Green, had already been out for 2 years and were dominating sales for Nintendo's handheld, the Game Boy. Since the boom of success, kids wanted more Pokemon wherever they could get it, and quickly, a trading card game was created, and in the next year, a TV show. I know most of you know this, but the TV show starred Ash, who traveled the Pokemon world with his partner and best friend Pikachu. Ash and Pikachu quickly became household names with many kids at the time, including myself, wishing they could be just like Ash. Many of my friends would name their character Ash in their copies of Pokemon games. The only issue was, you couldn't select Pikachu as a starter Pokemon. Now, it is important to mention that it is possible to catch a Pikachu in Viridian Forest in Pokemon Red and Blue, but with only a 5% encounter rate, many players would walk right through Viridian Forest and never see a Pikachu. With countless gamers looking up to and aspiring to be like Ash, Nintendo would make a third release, Pokemon Yellow, that had the protagonists start their journey with a Pikachu at their side, just like Ash. This game was ultimately pretty similar to Red and Blue, but just like Ash, Pikachu would remain outside of his Pokeball, walking with the player as they adventured on their journey. Pokemon Yellow was simply a release to allow players to be their Pokemon hero, but would end up creating a business model that spanned 4 generations and creating an interesting but confusing dynamic in the release of Pokemon games each generation. This all started because of this moment in gaming history. So yes, Pokemon Yellow kicked off the 3rd release Pokemon game. Also, yes, I know that it was technically the 4th release of Kanto, as Japan also had Pokemon Green, but you know what I mean. A new game released after the original dual releases that takes place in the same region as those games. While Pokemon Yellow had an easy to point to reason to be released, the ability to play through Kanto while walking in Ash's footsteps, the rest of the future 3rd releases didn't make as much sense. For clarity, I am referring to Pokemon Crystal, Pokemon Emerald, and Pokemon Platinum. I don't know about all of you guys, but these games confused the heck out of me as a kid. Don't get me wrong, all 3 of these games are some of my absolute favorites and hands down my favorite way to play through each of their respective regions, but during the time of their release in gaming history, it was very confusing. I'm not talking about how to beat the game confusing, I'm talking about the releases themselves. I believe that it was because of this confusion that the games, although improvements upon their regional counterparts, sold worse. I would like to focus and highlight on 3 main reasons for this confusion. Number 1, the location the game takes place in. 2, the purpose. What is the purpose of creating these games? 3, the chronology, where the game fits into the larger story of Pokemon. While looking at the location, we notice that the location of these 3rd release games are the same as their regional counterparts. You see, diehard Pokemon fans were eager to step foot in a new region the second that a game from that region dropped. We would then play the crap out of that game, exploring every nook and cranny of the region to find secrets, rare items, and rare Pokemon. We started from the bottom as a nobody without a Pokemon and emerged victorious as the champion of the region. Now not exploring the world as some punk kid, but instead as an important figure that meant something to the region and its people. The idea that we must start all over again in an almost identical game that takes place in the same location that we just beat only a couple years prior, where we would once again be a nobody and have to re-earn our status as the champion and a somebody, seemed more than a little silly. And especially when you look at the type of game that Pokemon is. Pokemon is a collectathon. Move over, Donkey Kong 64. Every Pokemon game has X amount of Pokemon that can be obtained. Every one of those Pokemon has a shiny form. Some have gender differences. Some have just other forms. All have genetics, IVs/DVs, to breed for. All have effort values, EVs, that you can train them in uniquely. All have countless movesets that can make two of the same Pokemon completely unique in use and battle style, and a crap ton of items that each of these Pokemon can hold. Not to mention abilities that didn't come into play until Generation 3, but is still noteworthy. And this is just the Pokemon themselves. Beyond this, there are even more collectibles that you can try to collect, like room decorations or secret base decorations, depending on which game you are playing. There is so much content in these games. To give you a full scope of the content in these games, Asteroid Videos has made an amazing video explaining how impossible it is to 100% Pokemon. I will link his video in the description, and I highly suggest that you go check it out. Now, I understand why Pokemon created this design. It is so that each player has a unique collection and experience from every other player who plays the game. People have to pour hours and hours into their games to collect everything that they want to collect. Asking them to flush those hours down the toilet to start from scratch on an almost identical game a couple years later is a tough ask. Although you can transfer a lot of these aspects over to your newer game, it wasn't as easy back then. You see, I grew up in a household that would allow only one new Pokemon game per region, and rightfully so. Why would my family pay full price for a game if 90% of the content is something that you could already experience in a previous game that you already own? I mean, as long as I had a friend who had a copy of the other generational releases, I could still complete my Pokedex. Unfortunately, being the eager kid that I was and wanting to get out into that region as soon as I could, I would always choose one of the games of the dual releases. Unfortunately, that meant I was always locked away from any bonus content that the third releases would have. And that brings me to our second point, purpose. Now, I'm not an idiot. I understand that from a business perspective, the reason to release a similar game again is for monetary reasons. However, none of these games, again Pokemon Crystal, Emerald, and Platinum, sold even half of the copies as their dual release counterparts. In order for people to buy your games, there needs to be not just a purpose, but a good enough purpose for them to spend their hard-earned money. As stated before, these third release games are the best games in their respective regions. But the purpose of these games has me asking more questions than getting answers. For example, I understand that there are a lot of improvements in these games. I love that Pokemon sprites are animated at the start of battles in Pokemon Crystal, and that Suicune has a much more prominent role in the story. I also love that you can get both Groudon and Kyogre in Pokemon Emerald, as opposed to just the box art Legendary in Ruby and Sapphire. These changes make the third release feel like the true story. But if that is so, then what was the point of the dual release stories? Are the dual releases some sort of beta game that we get to familiarize ourselves with the region until the full games come out? Or are the third release games some sort of DLC? The DLC answer feels more like the purpose to me, as a battle frontier, improved story, more legendaries, and quality of life improvements in all of these games feel like updates to the original. I would normally give a pass to this DLC answer, but we know that DLC was possible at the time. Platinum had Shaman, Darkrai, and Arceus by going to GameStop and receiving the item that was needed to trigger the event. Sidebar, I know that the Azure Flute from the Arceus event was never distributed, and that technically all of this content was already in the game and is just activated by an item. So it isn't technically DLC, and I would have to agree with you there. However, these games also had Wi-Fi connectivity, so updates could have been distributed just like updates are today for modern games. For Pokemon Emerald, we already know that DLC was possible, as we discussed the earliest form of DLC with the Game Boy e-reader in our Super Mario Advanced 4 episode of this series. Lastly, in Pokemon Crystal, there was a Japanese-only DLC event for Celebi that involved a peripheral for the Game Boy Color that allowed players to connect their Game Boys to their cell phones to get internet connectivity or something. Okay, this one may not be a very good argument, but it was at least possible, okay? I don't want to hold this DLC point for any of these games too harshly, as DLC like we know it today didn't really exist back then, and I'm sure it would have been way harder than I'm describing to add new content from these third release games into their dual release counterparts. But my point still stands that asking for full price for essentially some updates for games that players already own is a confusing concept and may not have enough purpose to justify buying the new game. Thirdly, chronology. The chronology point was extremely confusing for me as a kid when playing these games. It all starts when you take a look at Pokemon Platinum compared to Diamond and Pearl. Platinum is clearly in a different season, as there is snow where there isn't snow in Diamond and Pearl, and the characters dress warmer. It is something that I've actually really loved about the game, as it gives it this unique flair. It seems like it is screaming that it takes place after the events of Diamond and Pearl, like a sequel. However, in Pokemon Platinum, you still control the protagonist Lucas. Lucas is the same protagonist as Diamond and Pearl. So how does this make any sense? Does Lucas set off on his adventure in Diamond and Pearl in the summertime, become the champion, save the world, catch some legendary Pokemon, oh yeah, one of them being the god of their world, and then sometime in the winter get bored, release all of his Pokemon, and move back home, only for him to get another starter in the spring to set out on another journey? Okay, well, writing this script, it just kind of hit me that what if Lucas had so much fun in Diamond and Pearl that he asked his Pokemon Arceus to erase everyone's memories so that he could go back out on another journey and experience it all again, thus allowing the events of Platinum to take place. Right? Nintendo, make it canon. Anyways, obviously this scenario doesn't make any sense. The only answer that you get when Googling where these third release games take place chronologically is that they take place simultaneously with their dual release counterparts. What a lame answer. I mean, the stories are not the same. How is this possible? The more research and digging I do, the same answer keeps popping up. These third releases are the definitive versions of the games. But what the heck does that mean? Definitive. Serving to define, fix, or specify definitely. To clarify with a definitive statement. Having its fixed and final form. Providing a solution or final answer. Satisfying all criteria. The definitive treatment for an infection. A definitive answer to a dilemma. Synonyms: supreme, ultimate, absolute, and complete. What? So the original games don't matter? The ultimate retcon? What was the point of playing those games? A beta to hold us over until the main course could arrive? What about Mareep? You can't catch Mareep in Crystal, but you can in Gold. Confirmed Mareep doesn't live in Johto. Make it canon! Mareep does not exist in canon Johto. Now, obviously, I'm overreacting, but this is still extremely confusing. Now, truly looking at the definition of definitive, the definition that Pokemon is probably using is the definition to clarify with a definitive statement having its fixed and final form. Meaning that, just like we thought, these games are kind of like updates, the final form of the original game. Meaning, it's taking the wonderful versions of those dual releases and having you continue enjoying that same game and same region with a little more content in the third released game. Of course, with the frustrating task of needing to replay through the story once again. After Generation 4, we stopped getting third releases. Generations 5 and 7 gave us sequels to those dual releases, and Gen 6 and 8 didn't give us anything to build off of the original games. Except for DLC in Gen 8 that was actually really well done. Gen 9 also gave us DLC, but the possibility of a third Paldean game is still possible, although I would say is highly unlikely. I would say that due to poor sales and confusing nature of third release Pokemon games, they will forever remain a confusing moment in gaming history. Thanks for watching.
Before I go, I want to know how you interpret the third release Pokemon games. Are they retro forms of updates or DLC? Do they somehow fit inside of the Pokemon timeline? Is there any way to make sense of these games? Please let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, please let us know of any other moments in gaming history that you want us to cover next.